I often say that I was born under a lucky star, or perhaps a mischievous comet, seeing as the latter seems more appropriate to my disposition. Yet the facts, which are a troublesome lot and rarely appreciate a good story, insist that I arrived on November 30th, 1835, in a patch of Missouri called Florida. Florida, Missouri. The name suggests palm trees and ocean breeze, perhaps a languid air suitable for sleeping the day away. The reality was a village so small that if you sneezed while passing through, you'd miss half the population and perhaps the only general store. It was, I assure you, a place where ambition went to die a dignified, slow death. I was the sixth of 7 children, a position that guaranteed I was generally unnoticed, usually underfoot, and always ready to listen. My time in Florida was mercifully short, no more than 4 years, but long enough, I suppose, to acquire a stubborn resistance to all things quiet and uneventful. The great liberation, the true commencement of my life, came when my family packed up and moved 60 miles east, a journey which, in 1839, felt equivalent to sailing around the Horn. We landed in Hannibal. Ah, Hannibal! Imagine a boy suddenly plucked from a dim closet and set down in the middle of a carnival. That was the change. Florida was a thought. Hannibal was an experience. It sat perched on the banks of the Mississippi River, a boundless muddy highway that flowed out of the mysterious depths of the north and into the fiery heart of the Gulf. That river was the pulse of the American continent, and we lived right on its wrist. Missouri itself was a relatively new creation, a mere teenager, having only gained statehood in 21. It still wore the dust of the frontier, making up part of the very edge of what was considered the West. Though to my young eye, staring out at the limitless water, it felt like the center of the world. Hannibal was a magnificent spectacle of noise and purpose. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, damp cotton, and the faint, sweet smell of molasses leaking from barrels on the wharf. The paddle-wheelers were floating palaces, churning the river into a froth, carrying goods, rumors, preachers, gamblers, and truly spectacular liars. My youth in Hannibal gave me an education no book could ever transmit. I learned the language of the river, the mournful whistle of a fog-bound steamer, the sharp crack of a cotton bale rolling down the levee, the deep, soulful sigh of the current that never, for a single moment, paused in its work. Yet, Hannibal, like the rest of Missouri at the time, was a place built on sharp, undeniable contradictions, a place of liberty and bondage, of high aspiration and profound cruelty. Slavery was an ordinary feature of the landscape. My father, bless his stern, humorless soul, owned one enslaved person, a man named Jenny. This was not a source of great debate or moral agonizing in our household. It was, quite simply, the way things were. It was furniture. But the real schooling, the education that shaped the very marrow of my craft, did not occur within the confines of our neat, slightly ambitious clapboard house in town. It happened on my Uncle John's farm. Summers, blessed summers, were my ticket out of law and order, and into the rough, sprawling freedom of the countryside. Uncle John owned many more fields than my father, and consequently, many more enslaved people, a small community unto themselves. I'd arrive, usually covered in dust and sweat, and immediately shed the constraints of my town clothes and my town manners. The quarters were not the grand house. They were small, rough cabins built of rougher timber, gathered loosely back of the main dwelling. They were often smoky, always smelling of honest work and cooking greens. And they were, to a boy, the most compelling destination on the planet. I had no business being there, of course. A pale, skinny boy, with hair the color of wet sand, I was the son of the master's brother. Yet, there I was, daily, often long after the sun had sunk, and the moon hung high and creamy above the sycamore trees. They tolerated me. More than tolerated me, they included me. I'd sit on a low stool, sometimes just on the dirt floor, listening to the magnificent, unending flow of human narrative. The star of the show, for me, was often an older man, a man whose wisdom seemed to predate the state of Missouri itself. I've muddied the details of his name over the years, filing him away in the attic of my memory until, He's become a composite of every kind, shrewd, and utterly brilliant storyteller I ever met. Let us call him Uncle Daniel, for the sake of the tale. Uncle Daniel was the keeper of the improbable. His hands were gnarled from field work, but his voice was smooth as creek water running over polished stones. He never told stories for profit or for fame. He told them for survival, for comfort, and often, simply for the sheer delightful malice of a good twist. He spun tales that had arrived, centuries ago, across the ocean in the hold of a ship, tales of Brer Rabbit, outwitting the whole of creation, of witches who could turn into black cats, and of ghosts. Ah, the ghosts. Now, young Sam, he'd say, his eyes twinkling like distant sparks, you be careful now when you walk in the road past the swamp. That old spirit, he don't mind a man, but he loves a boy, likes to pull the soul right out through your ear. He spoke of impossible journeys, of men who could run faster than a railway train, of colossal beasts that lived in the dark corners of the Mississippi, and of hidden treasure buried by river pirates centuries before. These were the literary epics of my childhood, delivered with a gravity that made the reality of the dust and the chores seem thin and unconvincing. And the music. Oh, the spirituals. They were songs of crushing sadness, yes, but also of profound, unshakable hope, delivered with a harmony that seemed to vibrate in the very timbers of the cabin. When the men and women sang, the air itself changed. It became heavy with longing, yet simultaneously lightened by the promise of freedom. Whether that freedom lay across the Ohio River or on the other side of eternity, I didn't understand the true weight of those songs then. I was too busy being astonished by the rhythm, by the way Daniel could turn a simple tale of a coon hunt into a metaphor for human suffering. And then, without missing a beat, pivot to a ludicrous saga about a man who swallowed a lightning bug and could never turn off his smile. I was a sponge, soaking it all up. The cadence, the pacing, the use of hyperbole, the strategic pause for dramatic effect. The world I saw in the light of day was dull compared to the fantastical, glorious, often terrifying world I was permitted to enter inside those cabins at night. It was here, in the dim light of flickering oil lamps and the comfort of shared laughter, that the foundation of nearly every book I would later write was laid. The characters, the shrewd, the naive, the noble, the scoundrel, they all had their origins in those quarters. The voice, my voice, the wry, rambling, slightly exaggerated style that readers seemed to tolerate, was formed by the rhythm of those stories and the flow of the Mississippi. When I look back now, a tired old man who has seen too much of the spectacular and the ridiculous in this world, I realize those summers were the only genuine university I ever attended. The river taught me geography, the town taught me human vanity, the farm taught me labor, but the quarters taught me the limitless, magical power of story. They taught me that the truth is often much too dull to bother with, and that a beautiful, well-crafted lie can light up the night. And when I sit down to write even today, I still hear, faintly sometimes, the low rumble of Uncle Daniel. Durer's voice, telling me, clear as a bell across the decades, now Sam, you got to exaggerate a little bit. If you ain't lying for the betterment of the story, what good are you? A piece of advice, I might add, upon which I have built an entire career. That idyllic world of moonlit storytelling, however, was not destined to last. Life, as I've observed, rarely permits one to linger too long in the land of pure invention. Reality has a way of barging in, uninvited, with its dusty boots and its inconvenient demands. My father, bless his stern, humorless soul, whose brief mention earlier you might recall, had always been a man of quiet, unyielding expectations. He died in 47, when I was 11 years old, not with a bang, nor a particularly interesting whimper, but with the quiet finality of a closing book. It stripped the house of its last vestiges of solemn order, and more practically, of its primary means of income. Suddenly, the luxurious freedom of summer days spent amongst the quarters was replaced by the stark, unrelenting demands of necessity. My formal schooling, such as it was, a sporadic affair of primers and the occasional switch, came to an abrupt, unlamented halt. I was ushered into the practical world, a world where stories were no longer spun under a sycamore tree but pressed onto paper with ink and lead. I became a printer's apprentice. The printing office was a different sort of wilderness. Instead of the boundless Mississippi, I had the confined chaos of the composing room. The rhythmic clang of the presses replaced the river's sigh. The air, instead of smelling of damp cotton and molasses, was thick, with the metallic tang of lead type and the oily scent of fresh ink. My hands, once accustomed to whittling sticks and climbing trees, now learned the meticulous, almost sacred dance of arranging tiny metal letters into words, lines, paragraphs. It was here, in this grimy, industrious cubbyhole, that I found my second great university. My job, ostensibly, was to meticulously piece together the local newspaper, letter by painstaking letter. But what it truly was a license to read, to devour. Every single story, every advertisement, every editorial, every lurid account of faraway lands, or local scandals, passed first through my fingers and then, more importantly, through my brain. The world unfurled itself before me, not through the fanciful lens of Uncle Daniel's exaggerations, but through the stark, often clumsy, sometimes elegant prose of reporters and editors. I read about politicians grandiloquently proclaiming their virtues, about rogues making off with the county treasurer's till, about floods in distant Ohio, and epidemics striking New Orleans. I saw how a story could be twisted, embellished, or pared down to its skeletal truth. I understood, in a visceral way, how words, when carefully chosen and arranged, could sway opinions, incite passions, or simply convey the stark, unvarnished facts. Though I always maintained the latter was a monumental waste of good ink. The contrast was sharp, on one hand, the oral tradition, vibrant with human voice and imbued with an ancient magic on the other, the cold, exacting precision of print, a silent symphony of information. Yet, I began to see the threads connecting them, the rhythm of a well-written sentence, the dramatic pause before a revelation, the carefully constructed climax. These were not so different from the techniques Uncle Daniel employed around the fire. Only now, instead of hearing them, I was seeing them, dissecting them, building them myself with individual pieces of lead. My years in the printing office were a crucible, refining the raw ore of my imagination that had been forged in the quarters. If Uncle Daniel gave me the soul of a storyteller, the printing press gave me its skeleton, its sinews, its very mechanics. It taught me the craft, the quiet architecture behind the boisterous performance. It was a rigorous, often tedious education, punctuated by ink-stained fingers and the constant smell of lead, but it was invaluable, for it was there, amidst the clatter and the typecases, that I truly began to understand that the stories of the world, whether whispered, under a moonlit sky, or emblazoned in black and white, were all just different faces of the same magnificent, mischievous comet. The printing office, for all its invaluable lessons, eventually began to feel like a cage. I had devoured every scrap of news, every serialized novel, every political tirade, until the very scent of lead and ink became a whisper of confinement. I had learned the bones of storytelling, yes, but my imagination, once so wild and free, by the Mississippi, yearned to put flesh on those bones, to give them voice myself. The world was larger than our local gazette, and I, at 18, felt an irresistible pull towards its wider pages. So, I packed my meager belongings, bid farewell to the clattering presses, and headed east to the bustling, cacophonous metropolises of New York City and Philadelphia. There, I found work in bigger newspaper offices, institutions that hummed with a different kind of energy. I wasn't just setting type anymore. I was chasing stories, interviewing characters, whose lives were far removed from the quiet rhythms of Hannibal. I honed my prose, learned the art of the snappy headline, the compelling lead, and the persuasive argument. I dabbled in articles, found a measure of success, and for a time felt I was truly becoming a man of letters, carving my own voice from the endless chatter of the city. But the East, for all its opportunities, felt different. It lacked the soulful breath of the Mississippi. The river, my childhood companion, beckoned. By 1857, its call was too strong to ignore. I returned home, not to print, but to water. I apprenticed myself to a riverboat pilot, learning the shifting currents, the hidden snags, the landmarks whispered in the fog. It was a return to the open sky and the grand, meandering narrative of the river, a living story that changed with every bend and every season. For 4 glorious years, I was a pilot, watching the world drift by from the pilot house, gathering a treasury of tales and characters as rich and varied as the cargo we carried. It was a freedom unlike any I'd known, a harmony between the observational eye of a writer and the hands-on expertise of a craftsman. Then, the cannons roared. The Civil War erupted in 1861, and the majestic flow of the Mississippi, once a highway of commerce and dreams, became a battleground, its traffic brought to a grinding halt. My piloting career, like so many other lives, was shipwrecked overnight. I remember a brief, bewildering stint with the Marion Rangers, a volunteer Confederate unit. 2 weeks of dusty marches and ill-fitting uniforms were enough to convince me that my talents lay not in prosecuting wars, but in observing the peculiar folly of those who did. The West was calling then, a new frontier ablaze with the fever of the Nevada silver rush. My brother Orion, ever the pragmatist with a touch of the romantic, had secured an appointment as Secretary of the Nevada Territory, and his invitation was a lifeline. In July of '61, I traded the stagnant waters of the Mississippi for the vast, untamed expanse of the American frontier. The journey itself, by stagecoach across deserts and mountains, was a story unfolding before my very eyes. I saw things I'd only read about in those small-town newspapers, towering peaks, sagebrush, plains, and for the first time, the proud, enigmatic faces of Native American tribes. I met a parade of rogues, dreamers, swindlers, and saints, each one a ripe character, each incident a kernel for a future tale. It was the wild, sprawling sequel to Uncle Daniel's fireside sagas, played out on a stage as immense as the sky. I tried my hand at prospecting, of course. For a while, the dust and the fever of silver gripped me, like it did so many others. I burrowed into hillsides, dreamt of fortunes, and quickly learned that loads were more prevalent in barroom boasts than in the earth itself. My pickaxe was a poor storyteller. My pen, however, was finding its voice. Thus, it was in the rough and tumble town of Virginia City, Nevada, after failing spectacularly to strike it rich with a shovel, that I found my true calling anew. The territorial enterprise offered me a column, a chance to chronicle the absurdities and adventures of this new raw world. It was there, amidst the clatter of the saloon and the scent of gunpowder, that I first signed my name not as Sam Clemens, but as Mark Twain. The river had given me the name, the printing press had given me the tools, and the West was now giving me the canvas. By 1864, the Nevada silver had fizzled for me, but my writing had not. The lure of an even bigger city, San Francisco, called, promising more stories, more characters, and a wider audience for the observations of this newly christened chronicler of human nature. The comet, it seemed, was still very much on the move. The dust of Virginia City was still clinging to my boots when I arrived in San Francisco, but the scent of stale whiskey and printer's ink had already replaced the metallic tang of silver ore in my expectations. I was done with shovels, done with the siren song of the Comstock lode, which had promised a palace and delivered a pauper, albeit a pauper with a thriving sideline in public slander. San Francisco was grander, certainly, but colder in its indifference. The city was a sprawling matron demanding tribute, and my previous triumphs in Nevada were small change here. I wrote for the Morning Call, and the struggle was immediate and sharp. The pay was meager, and the requirement to churn out daily observations on everything, from streetcar collisions to the latest political idiocy, was a constant drain. My humor, honed on the raw edge of the frontier, often scraped against the smoother sensibilities of the Bay Area readership, resulting in more than one dressing down from an editor who failed utterly to appreciate the grandeur of a well-placed insult. I was nearing the end of my tether, contemplating a return to river piloting or perhaps a career as a professional borrower, when fate, which always seemed to delight in handing me a winning lottery ticket wrapped in a wet trout, intervened. The great humorist, Artemus Ward, was passing through, and he had asked me, Sam Clemens, to contribute a little sketch to a forthcoming collection. I had nothing suitable. My best gags had already been spent on various newspapers, but I recalled a rambling, utterly useless tale told to me by a grizzled old drunk named Ben Coon in a mining camp tavern. It was about a damned fool named Jim Smiley and his preposterous collection of betting animals, chief among them a frog, named Daniel Webster, who was capable of impressive vertical trajectory until sabotaged by a mouthful of quail shot. I hammered out the yarn, a little piece of ridiculous Western folklore saturated in dry, casual exaggeration. I sent it off to Ward, then promptly forgot about it, assuming it would vanish into the literary ether like half my mining claims. It did not vanish. Ward, for reasons history has never fully explained, never used the story. But he forwarded it, and, after a series of hilarious editorial miscommunications and delays, a fitting christening for any piece of my work, it was published in the East in the Saturday Press in November 1865. Under the title, Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. The effect was immediate, astonishing, and entirely inexplicable to me. People did not merely read the story, they stole it. They copied it. It spread like wildfire, being reprinted in papers from New York to New Orleans. Suddenly, I wasn't just Sam Clemens, the local journalist, who told a good joke at the bar. I was Mark Twain, the author of this absurd, universally beloved frontier trifle. The nation, apparently, was starved for a frog story. The air in California changed overnight. Editors who had previously eyed me with suspicion now looked at me with the calculating glint reserved for a freshly discovered gold strike. The Sacramento Union, ever shrewd, decided to capitalize on the newfound notoriety and offered me a commission I couldn't. To refuse, travel to the Sandwich Islands, the exotic volcanic paradise now called Hawaii, and report on my experiences. For 4 glorious months, I traded the fog and grit of San Francisco for the warm, humid spell of the Pacific. I watched volcanoes erupt, endured the hospitality of the islanders, and chronicled it all with the kind of wide-eyed, yet slightly cynical enthusiasm that was fast becoming my trademark. The descriptions were vivid, the observations sharp, and the letters I sent back were an instant success, providing readers with escapism laced with irreverent realism. Upon my return in late 1866, the readership was ravenous. My career had expanded beyond the page. It was demanding a stage. I was encouraged, pushed frankly by my friends who saw a lucrative opportunity to try lecturing. The thought terrified me. Standing before an audience, exposed and vulnerable, was a different beast entirely from hiding behind a pen name. But I needed the money, and the fame was a tool that needed wielding. I booked a hall and, trembling with nervousness, stepped out to face the mob. I spoke, of course, about the Sandwich Islands, but laced the travelogue with calculated digressions, feigned confusion, and self-deprecating remarks about my own clumsiness. The audience roared. It was a revelation. I discovered that I did not merely write humor, I could perform it. My failures as a miner, a soldier briefly, and a speculator had somehow culminated in making me an overnight success as a professional fool. The lecture tour that followed was a triumph, establishing me as a successful stage performer, a monologist who mixed high travel with low dialect and who could bring the house down by simply pausing in the wrong place. The West had given me my name, my reputation, and my confidence. It was time for the East to give me my fortune. In early 1867, I signed a lucrative contract with the San Francisco Alta, California, to continue my travel writing, this time from New York and points east. I packed my notebooks, my growing stack of newspaper clippings, and my newly acquired certainty, and boarded a train bound for the Atlantic. New York was overwhelming, a magnificent, terrifying engine of commerce, but I felt ready for it. I arrived, delivered my initial pieces, and then turned my attention to a larger scheme. The Alta and a group of ambitious, wealthy men had chartered the magnificent sidewheel steamer, the Quaker City, for what was billed as the Grand Excursion, a massive, 5-month tour of Europe and the Holy Land. It was a pilgrimage of American affluence designed for rich folk who, wished to see the ancient world from the comfort of modern luxury. I quickly signed on, securing passage in exchange for a series of letters to be published in the Alta. In June 1867, we sailed. The trip was a goldmine of material. My fellow passengers were a curated collection of pious, pompous, and profoundly uninteresting Americans determined to be impressed by history, whether they understood it or not. I, meanwhile, was determined to be unimpressed by the sheer amount of venerated rubbish and the over-the-top religiosity of the pilgrimage. My letters, vivid descriptions mixed with tongue-in-cheek mockery of both the ruins and our reaction to them, became instantly beloved by my audience back home. They were the genesis of what would become my first full-length book, The Innocents Abroad. It was on that voyage, navigating the endless sea of grandiloquent banality, that I encountered a young man named Charles Langdon. Charlie was amiable, easygoing, and utterly devoted to his family. We became fast friends, sharing cigars and gossip, often meeting in the cluttered saloon of the steamer. One evening, while we were discussing the absurdities of relic worship in some ancient port, Charlie pulled a small oval photograph from his wallet. "My sister Olivia," he said, handing the picture over with an air of proud reverence. "Thought you might appreciate seeing her." I took the photograph. In the dim lamplight of the steamer, I saw a face that was severe, yet beautiful, intelligent, and imbued with an almost frightening moral purity. Her eyes, even in the faded image, seemed to possess a gentle scrutiny, as if she were weighing the wisdom of the universe and finding it marginally wanting. The effect was instantaneous and profound. It wasn't merely attraction, it was a physical jolt, a flash of recognition so powerful it stopped the world spinning. Here was the angel, the vision of moral perfection that this grubby, irreverent 40-times failed journalist and professional hoax peddler had never known he was looking for. I, Samuel Clemens, alias Mark Twain, the man who had seen fire, flood, and frontier, madness, the man who had perfected the art of the cynical sneer, was struck dumb. I was in love. "She is magnificent, Charlie," I managed, my voice suddenly thick. I looked at the image for a long time, committing the gentle curve of her brow and the serious set of her mouth to memory. I handed the picture back, but the damage was done. My comet, previously rocketing toward the next great story, had just been caught by the gravitational pull of a small, stern, beautiful star named Olivia Langdon. My adventures had just found their fixed point. The world of travel and satire was about to collide violently with the world of domesticity and devotion. And I knew, with a certainty I'd never felt while standing over a mining hole, that this time I wouldn't fail. I handed the picture back, but the damage was done. My comet, previously rocketing toward the next great story, had just been caught by the gravitational pull of a small, stern, beautiful star named Olivia Langdon. My adventures had just found their fixed point. The world of travel and satire was about to collide violently with the world of domesticity and devotion. And I knew, with a certainty I'd never felt while standing over a mining hole, that this time I wouldn't fail. The collision was not instant. It was a 2-year campaign, fought not with pistols and oaths, but with polished boots and painfully rehearsed platitudes. To secure Livy, that is, to secure the peace of my own soul, I first had to dismantle Sam Clemens, the wild humorist of the Pacific Slope, and reassemble him as Samuel, the respectable man of letters. It was a hellish undertaking, akin to trying to teach a coyote to play the harpsichord. Livy's family, particularly her stern and profoundly good father, Jervis Langdon, treated me like an interesting, perhaps explosive, geological specimen brought in from the wild. They examined my rough edges, my predilection for blasphemy, my tendency to smoke up 3 rooms at once, my notorious history of having no history save for failure and travel, and decided that I was, at best, a temporary phenomenon. They were right to be suspicious. When I first met Livy in person, my whole wardrobe seemed to shrink in deference to her quiet dignity. I was a man who had made a career of mocking the sacred cows of society, and here was a woman who was herself the highest, most tenderly guarded breed of sacred cow. She was goodness personified, a delicate bloom nourished on Unitarian ethics and wealth, while I was literary manure, rich in anecdote but wholly unreliable. Yet, I persevered. I courted her with an almost terrifying sincerity, writing letters that were half theological treatise on my own redemption and half urgent demand for her attention. I found that her quiet disapproval of my worst excesses, my brute strength, as she called my boisterousness, had the effect of cleaning my clock. I longed to be worthy of her, which was a new and revolutionary sensation for a man who had previously only longed for a clean shave and a full audience. The opposition slowly crumbled, worn down by my persistence and perhaps, also, by the Langdon family's growing reluctant fondness for my better jokes. On the 2nd day of February 1870, we were married in Elmira. Marriage, I quickly discovered, was a great heavy padlock on the door of my bachelor restlessness. The first address of our domestic destiny was Buffalo, New York, where I had invested heavily in the Buffalo Express. A grave error, but a necessary one. I required an occupation that looked respectable on paper, something to suggest I was no longer prone to sailing away on the next steamboat bound for the Amazon. I was now an editor, a partner, a pillar of the community, and a newly minted slave to the mortgage. The transition was jarring. My days were no longer spent scratching out essays in dingy newspaper offices or swapping lies in Sacramento saloons. They were spent attempting to be punctual for dinner, discussing draperies, and trying not to smoke my wife's elegant furniture into ruin. Livy attempted, with the patience of a saint wrestling a badger, to polish my manners. She would read my newspaper columns aloud, placing a small, precise finger on any phrase that she deemed profane or coarse. "Samuel," she would say, her brow slightly curved in that familiar, serious set I had memorized from the photograph. "You must not use such language. It is beneath you." And I, the man who had faced down rowdies and swindlers, would merely wilt. "But Livy, my dear, it is the truth. I am merely painting society as it is." "Then paint it more delicately, Sam. You must lift them up, not drag yourself down." She was my editor, my conscience, and my most merciless critic, and I worshipped her for it. The collision of our worlds was constant, sometimes humorous, sometimes terrifying. I was the boisterous, untamed frontier. She was the quiet, secure parlor. And somewhere between the two, we began to construct a home. In the autumn of that year, 1870, the universe presented us with the ultimate terrifying proof of my commitment. Our son, Langdon Clemens, arrived. Holding that tiny, red, indignant scrap of humanity, introduced a whole new strata of fear into my life. Previously, if I failed alone. I was fleet, disposable. Now, I felt rooted to the earth by this fragile, dependent creature. All the adventures I had craved suddenly seemed frivolous, dangerous even. I, the great satirist who mocked human folly, was now paralyzed by the ordinary, domestic folly of trying to keep a clean diaper on a squirming infant. Buffalo, however, proved to be an unsatisfying anchor. It was the place of transition, the necessary purgatory before paradise. By 1871, I needed more intellectual stimulation, more friends who understood the complex, absurd machinery of the publishing world, and frankly, Livy needed to be closer to her own kin for support. We moved to Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford was, for a man like me, a revelation. It was a city dedicated to respectability, yes, but also a cauldron of literature, wealth, and profound Yankee ingenuity. We rented a house in the famed Nook Farm, a residential precinct where authors, industrialists, and reformers lived in comfortable, argumentative proximity. Here, among people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Charles Dudley Warner, I found I could finally be Sam Clemens, the educated, ambitious writer, without entirely giving up the rough charm of Mark Twain. The environment nourished my ambition, demanding not just success, but permanence. The year 1872 was an absolute vertigo of extremes, a year that proved Livy. His pull was not just romance, but destiny braided with immediate, awful consequence. I had spent the previous years shaping my chaotic, roaring memories of Nevada, California, and the Sandwich Islands into a massive volume. It was the last great expenditure of my bachelor energy, the final glorious account of my comet's trajectory before it settled. That spring, Roughing It was published. It was a grand success, a deluge of laughter and recognition. The world was now convinced that the humorist had found his voice and his market. Financially secure, I began planning the construction of our permanent house, a strange, gorgeous monument to my devotion and my newly acquired domesticity. But while the press was singing my praises, life was delivering its cruelest lessons within the walls of our rented Nook Farm home. Langdon, my little boy, my first root in the domestic soil, fell ill with diphtheria. When the laughter ends, the true worth of a man is tested. My famed ability to control the narrative failed entirely here. I could not negotiate, bribe, or satirize death away. The great, strong adventurer was reduced to a helpless, weeping father, watching his beautiful 2-year-old son fade into silence. The pain left a great, raw cavity in the heart of our household. It was the dark cost of the fixed point. Domesticity, I realized, was not just velvet and devotion, it was vulnerability without armor. I had risked everything and lost the most precious stake. I felt, in the aftermath, that my resolve must surely break, that the old, restless urge to flee, to escape the sight of the empty crib, would overwhelm me. But Livy was there, fragile but unbreakable. She bore the grief with a quiet, powerful strength that shamed my own desperate sorrow. She didn't flee the memory, she enshrined it. And then, in the midst of that devastating gloom, came the sun. Just a few short months after Langdon's passing, our daughter, Susie Clemens, was born. The arrival of Susie, plump and noisy and so gloriously, aggressively alive, was a miracle and a necessity. She was the immediate, urgent affirmation that life and devotion must continue, even when tragedy strikes. We had lost one fixed point, but another had immediately sprung up, demanding attention, demanding continuation. Standing over Susie's crib, the weight of the previous year heavy upon me, I understood. The depth of the commitment I had made the moment I first saw Livy's photograph. I was no longer merely chronicling the world's chaos. I was actively building a sanctuary against it. My failures in the mining camps and on the river had taught me only how to escape. My success in Hartford, bought at the terrifying price of Langdon's life, taught me how to stay. The collision was complete. The world of travel was now just material for the printing press. The world of devotion was my foundation. I was Samuel Clemens, husband, father, homeowner, a man anchored firmly in the soil of Connecticut, compelled forward by the demanding, quiet love of his stern and beautiful star. I would write for the world, but I would live, truly live, only for the home we were building, a structure of brick, mortar, and absolute fidelity. And this time I swore, no matter the cost, I would never let it fall. Standing over Susie's crib, the weight of the previous year heavy upon me, I understood the depth of the commitment I had made the moment I first saw Livy's photograph. I was no longer merely chronicling the world's chaos, I was actively building a sanctuary against it. My failures in the mining camps and on the river had taught me only how to escape. My success in Hartford, bought at the terrifying price of Langdon's life, taught me how to stay. The collision was complete. The world of travel was now just material for the printing press. The world of devotion was my foundation. I was Samuel Clemens, husband, father, homeowner, a man anchored firmly in the soil of Connecticut, compelled forward by the demanding, quiet love of his stern and beautiful star. I would write for the world, but I would live, truly live, only for the home we were building, a structure of brick, mortar, and absolute fidelity. And this time, I swore, no matter the cost, I would never let it fall. I pressed a soft kiss to Susie's downy forehead, the scent of milk and baby powder a gentle anchor in the room. The world outside, however, refused to be so easily tamed by domestic bliss. Even as I plotted new walls and imagined the laughter that would fill them, the din of a nation, growing recklessly rich, sacrificing integrity at the altar of acquisition, grated at my sensibilities. My pen, once a restless canoe on a raging river, now felt like a plumb bob, seeking a true north from the very foundations of my home, determined to expose the unsteady footing of the broader society. It was in this vein that Charles Dudley Warner, bless his sober Yankee heart, found me. Charles, editor of the Hartford Courant and a man whose moral compass pointed as true as Livy's, shared my growing disquiet. We'd sit in my study, the plans for our elaborate future home spread across the desk amidst strewn manuscripts, and discuss the peculiar madness seizing America. It was 1873, and the air hummed with an almost sickening buzz of speculation, political, back-scratching, and a vulgar display of wealth that seemed wholly disconnected from honest toil. Washington was a cesspool of influence peddling, and the great industrialists, those captains of industry, were often little more than pirates in top hats. "It's a gilded age, Sam," Warner had mused one evening, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Shiny on the outside, but underneath, all dross and common metal." The phrase struck me like a lightning bolt. The Gilded Age. It perfectly captured the hollow grandeur. And so, in the very years we were pouring brick and laying stone for our own grand edifice, I found myself, with Charles, dissecting the very fever of acquisition that seemed to seize the nation. We wrote, with a kind of righteous fury, about politicians who lined their pockets, about businessmen who crushed rivals with impunity, about the universal American obsession with getting rich, no matter the means. It was a scathing indictment of superficial prosperity, a dark comedy of hubris and venality. The irony of it, I confess, was not lost on me. Here I was, crafting a searing critique of moneyed excess, of a society obsessed with outward show, even as our own sprawling 25-room mansion began to rise on Farmington Avenue. The architect's drawings, with their turrets and intricate brickwork, their soaring ceilings and grand fireplaces, represented a sum, a terrifying sum, between $40,000 and $45,000. That would make any honest frontiersman choke on his tobacco. It was a vast sum, even for Livy's family, but I rationalized it fiercely. This was not a monument to greed. It was a sanctuary forged in the crucible of my commitment. It was a fortress against the very chaos I chronicled, a tangible manifestation of the unwavering fidelity I owed to Livy, to Susie, and to the memory of Langdon. Livy, of course, understood. Her practical eye saw the value in a stable, beautiful home for our growing family, a place where children could thrive and ideas could flourish. She was the one who curated the plans, who envisioned the flow of light and life through those grand spaces. For her, it wasn't about mere ostentation, but about creating a haven, a place of beauty and permanence that reflected the strength and depth of our bond. She approved of my work with Charles too, appreciating the moral backbone it required. She was my stern, beautiful star, guiding me not only in the domestic sphere, but in the ethical one as well. Every morning, before the relentless tapping of my pen began on the pages of the Gilded Age, I would survey the construction site. The air was thick, with the scent of fresh, cut lumber and wet mortar. Hammers rang out like chimes, saws buzzed, and the rhythmic shouts of the workmen lifted into the crisp Connecticut air. I saw not just bricks and beams, but the embodiment of my promise. Each foundation stone laid was a reaffirmation of my resolve. Each rising wall segment was a bulwark against the precariousness of my past, a tangible manifestation of my commitment to stay. This house, slowly taking shape, with its distinctive gables and quirky details, was more than just a home. It was a declaration, a physical manifestation of my refusal to let the chaos of the world, or more terrifyingly, my own inherent restlessness, undo what I had found. The dual labors were immense. By day, I wrestled with Colonel Sellers and the ludicrous schemes of Washington, D.C., my mind sharp and critical, dissecting the follies of men driven by avarice. By afternoon, I walked the rising floors of our future home, my mind shifting to the placement of a window, the curve of a staircase, the exact shade of brick. The exhaustion was profound, a deep ache in my bones, but it was a satisfying one. For every sentence I carved out, exposing a national shame, I was also building a private world of unwavering honor. As 1874 dawned, and the final touches were applied to the elaborate 25-room structure, a year after the Gilded Age hit the presses and sparked its own furor, I stood once more by Susie's crib, the sounds of finishing carpenters echoing faintly through the solid walls. The house was complete, an extravagant testament to my success, yet it was also a humble offering, a vessel filled with the fierce, protective love of a man who had finally found his true mooring. The book warned the world of the dangers of its glittering facade, but the house, this grand, absurd, beautiful house, was my oath. And this time I swore, no matter the cost, no matter the temptations of further speculation, or the inevitable tests the future would bring, I would never, ever let it fall. The house stood, proud and impossibly solid against the crisp New England sky. Its impossibly steep gables, its whimsical turrets, its very unconventionality, was a defiance, a beacon against the very rot I'd tried to expose. It was a monument to hard-won stability, a stark contrast to the shifting sands of national ambition and the fickle favor of public opinion. The scent of sawdust and fresh varnish, though fading, still clung to the air, a potent reminder of the effort it had taken to erect this sanctuary. But the sanctuary, once built, demanded its own rituals. The days that followed the house's completion were not to be filled with the leisurely contemplation of literary ghosts. Livy, though my steadfast partner in both domestic and intellectual pursuits, had her own exacting standards, and the management of a household of this magnitude was a project in itself. Staff had to be hired and trained, linens procured and embroidered, menus planned and executed with the precision of a military campaign. Our daughters, growing and blossoming, each required their own particular brand of attention, their laughter and squabbles weaving a new kind of music into the grand rooms. And then there was the writing. The quiet hours I'd carved out in London, wrestling with the very soul of America, were now a distant memory. The pressure to produce, to strike, while the iron of public interest was still hot, was relentless. The success of the Gilded Age had been intoxicating, but it was also a gilded cage. Publishers clamored for more, readers demanded the familiar, and the critics, who had initially lauded my efforts, now seemed poised to pounce on any perceived misstep. I found myself, much like Colonel Sellers, juggling a multitude of schemes. Though mine were of a different, perhaps more perilous kind. The urge to build, to create, had not been sated by brick and mortar alone. The allure of speculation, the promise of quick returns, the very essence of the system I critiqued, began to whisper at the edges of my mind. It was a seductive siren song, promising to further secure this newfound haven, to inject even more ease into our lives. Livy, ever the anchor, would watch me with a knowing glance, her silence often more potent than any spoken warning. The summer refuge in Elmira became an essential lifeline. For months each year, I would retreat to my sister-in-law Susan's farm, a place blessedly devoid of the constant hum of Hartford society and the clatter of our own magnificent, demanding house. There, amidst the rustling cornfields and the gentle lapping of the Kemung River, the noise of the world would recede, and the characters who had been waiting in the wings would begin to take their rightful place. It was in Elmira, under a sky vast and indifferent, that the adventures of Tom Sawyer began to take its shape. The mischievous spirit of my own boyhood, the lazy indolence of Hannibal, Missouri, the simple, unadorned truths of childhood, these were the threads I spun. It was a simpler tale, a balm to the jangled nerves of the nation, and perhaps to my own. Yet, even in its apparent innocence, there was a current of observation, a subtle commentary on the hypocrisies that even a child's world could not entirely escape. The years flowed on, marked by the birth of Clara and later Jean, each a tiny new star in our constellation. The house, though grand, was no longer merely a monument. It was a home, alive with the ebb and flow of family life. But the shadow of Sellers and the lessons of the Gilded Age never truly left me. The world I knew was a perpetual motion machine of ambition and exploitation, and my own creations, both literary and architectural, were but temporary bulwarks against its relentless surge. The Prince and the Pauper emerged next, a fable of mistaken identity and the stark realities of class. It was a more direct confrontation with the societal structures that I found so troubling, a quiet plea for empathy in a world increasingly defined by division. Then came life on the Mississippi, a return to the river that had shaped me, a nostalgic, yet unsentimental journey through a landscape undergoing seismic change. But it was the whispers of a greater project, a more profound indictment, that began to stir in the quiet spaces of Elmira. A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court, a searing critique of blind faith in progress, a warning against the seductive allure of unchecked technological advancement. It was a complex tapestry, woven with threads of satire, irony, and a deep-seated concern for the human spirit. And then, like a rogue wave, came the notion for Huckleberry Finn. It was a tale that had been simmering for years, a character who had first appeared, a supporting player in Tom Sawyer's world, but who now demanded his own voice. Huck, the outcast, the boy who rafted down the Mississippi, escaping the suffocating embrace of civilization, was the perfect vehicle to explore the deepest moral stain on the American soul, slavery. The writing of Huckleberry Finn was a different kind of labor. It was not merely about exposing national shame. It was about wrestling with conscience, about confronting the ingrained prejudices that even I, with all my pronouncements, still carried within. The language was rougher, the themes darker, the satire sharper. It was a book that would not be easily dismissed as mere entertainment. The decision to publish it myself, through the Charles L. Webster Company, was a bold one, born of a desire for artistic control, and a hope for substantial profit, a hope that would, with its own cruel irony, ultimately prove to be a double-edged sword. The establishment of the company was a gamble, a further step into the realm of speculation that I had sworn to navigate with caution. The ensuing years would bring their own triumphs and tribulations. The immense success of Ulysses S. Grant's personal memoirs, a project that honored a tarnished, but still significant figure and provided a financial lifeline, felt like a vindication. But the business of publishing, I was quickly learning, was a treacherous river, much like the Mississippi itself, filled with hidden snags and unexpected currents. The house in Hartford, that grand, absurd, beautiful testament to my ambition, would witness more than just the creation of literature. It would also bear witness to the precarious dance between art and commerce, between personal integrity and the insatiable demands of the world. The oath I had sworn, standing by Susie's crib, to keep this private world of honor intact, would be tested in ways I could not yet even imagine. The oath I had sworn, standing by Susie's crib, to keep this private world of honor intact, would be tested in ways I could not yet even imagine. For even as Huckleberry Finn sailed forth into the world, a tempest was brewing in my own counting house. The success of Grant's memoirs, that sweet taste of vindication, had, alas, only emboldened my most foolish impulses. I had a weakness, you see, a fatal fascination with patents and progress, with engines that promised miracles and typesetting machines that swore to revolutionize the very act of writing. I saw myself not merely as a wordsmith, but as an impresario of ingenuity, a financier of the future. The Hartford House, with its outlandish architecture and its many gilded rooms, became not just a sanctuary for art, but a crucible for increasingly desperate gambles. The river of commerce, as I had observed, was indeed treacherous. My publishing company, the very vehicle for my artistic control and financial ambition, foundered not long after. The Charles L. Webster Company, that grand experiment, became another casualty of my boundless, ill-placed optimism. The double-edged sword I had envisioned cut deep, excoriating me with debts that stretched like the Mississippi itself, from horizon to horizon. The grand, absurd, beautiful house in Hartford, once a symbol of my triumph, became a monument to my folly. To keep my head above water, to honor my creditors, and more importantly, to preserve what little remained of my good name, a move was necessitated, a retreat of sorts. In 1891, we packed our lives and our hopes, trading the familiar shores of the Connecticut River for the distant, unfamiliar landscapes of Europe. It was a strange, dislocating, purgatorial kind of existence, these years spent wandering. The purpose was clear: economize, pay back, survive. But the heart, It clung to the ghosts of Hartford, to the echoes of Susie's laughter in those now empty rooms. The financial ruin, a humiliation so profound it chafed like a hair shirt, demanded a public atonement. And so, the lecture tour. Imagine, if you will, the author of Huckleberry Finn, the satirist of American hypocrisy, now hawking his wit and wisdom. Across the globe, a performing monkey in a white suit, all to salvage the wreckage of his entrepreneurial misadventures. From Sydney to Bombay, from London to Cape Town, I spoke, I charmed, I told tales. Each laugh. From the audience, a coin in the coffers, each coin a tiny chip at the mountain of debt. It was an exercise in self-flagellation, a penance paid in public, and it wore a man down to the bone. But even as I battled the ghosts of my own financial ruin, a far more devastating blow awaited. In 1896, the year of my relentless circuit, tragedy, with its cruel and indifferent hand, reached across oceans and gripped Hartford. Susie, my brilliant, beautiful Susie, the one who saw the world with such clear, unblinking eyes, succumbed to meningitis in the very house we had been forced to abandon. My private world of honor, that oath sworn by her crib, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The news, relayed by telegram, struck me like a physical blow. To be so far, so utterly helpless, while my child fought for her life. And lost it, in the place that held so many of our dearest memories. It was a wound that would never truly heal. We never returned to Hartford to live, Livy and I. How could we? The very air there would have been thick with the unbearable weight of her absence, the house a mausoleum to our lost joy. The decades that followed Susie's death, though they saw my finances slowly restored, were steeped in a different kind of darkness. My travels, initially a financial necessity, became an unwilling classroom. As I crisscrossed the globe, the veil of American exceptionalism, the idea that our republic was somehow immune to the avarice of the old world, began to fray and fall away. I witnessed firsthand the rapacious hand of European powers, carving up continents, trampling over native peoples, all in the name of civilization and commerce. My anger, once mostly directed at the foibles and moral hypocrisies of my countrymen, now swelled into a righteous, universal wrath. The Boer War in South Africa, the Boxer Rebellion in China, these were not distant skirmishes, but symptoms of a global disease, a rampant imperialism fueled by greed and a sickening sense of racial superiority. And then, in 1898, the disease came home. The Spanish-American War, followed swiftly by the brutal conflict in the Philippines, made it clear that America, my America, was not immune. The very nation I had often chastised but always loved, was now donning the uniform of the oppressor. My wrath, sharpened by personal loss and global observation, found a new, compelling target. The language I had used for Huckleberry Finn, rougher, darker, sharper, now found a new application. When I finally returned to the United States in 1900, my debts paid, my financial fortunes mended, I was a different man. The old Mark Twain, the genial humorist, still existed, but he was now irrevocably fused with a furious, disillusioned prophet. The world, through Susie's death and through the horrors I had witnessed, had taught me a terrible truth. That honor, whether personal or national, was a fragile thing, easily corrupted, easily broken. I declared myself, without hesitation, an anti-imperialist. From 1901 until my dying day, I lent my voice and my pen, now sharper than any surgeon, scalpel, to the cause, serving as the vice president of the Anti-Imperialist League. The private world of honor I had tried to protect was gone, but in its place stood a public, uncompromising commitment to a different kind of truth, a truth born of sorrow and outrage, a truth that would not be silenced. The year 1901 was not a time for gentle satire. It was a time for bludgeons, for acid, for the unvarnished, ugly truth, and I wielded them all. The lecture halls that had once buzzed with laughter now often crackled with a different kind of energy, a mix of fervent agreement, outraged indignation, and the uncomfortable silence of those sensing a profound shift in the very air I breathed. I stood before them, not as the white-suited jester they remembered, but as a man stripped bare by grief and global folly, pointing a bony finger at the emperor's new clothes, or rather his bloody, ill-gotten raiments. "We have gone forth to conquer," I'd declare, my voice raspy with conviction, "not to civilize. We have traded our ideals for islands, our honor for empire, and our very souls for a few paltry dollars and a dubious, manifest destiny that smells suspiciously of the devil's own enterprise." My pen, once a partner in playful mischief, became a weapon. I wrote of the Philippine-American War with a ferocity that startled even myself, railing against the blessings of civilization that rained bombs upon brown skins and twisted the very meaning of freedom. I saw the hypocrisy of a nation founded on rebellion, now crushing the rebellion of others, and it nauseated me. I penned essays like To the Person Sitting in Darkness and The War Prayer, works so searing, so utterly devoid of the saccharine sentimentality expected of a national treasure that many editors flinched. Some refused them outright, fearing the wrath of public opinion, or worse, the official censure that hovered like a gallows shadow over any who dared question the prevailing narrative of American exceptionalism. "They call me a traitor," I once quipped to Howells, a grim smile twisting my lips. A traitor to what? To the senseless slaughter of innocents? To the grand delusion that might makes right? If so, then let the hangman prepare his noose, for I'll wear the title, with more pride than any medal of valor pinned to a conqueror's chest. Such pronouncements, of course, did not endear me to the powerful. My lecture tours, though still drawing crowds, now garnered as much opprobrium as applause. The very livelihood I had so painstakingly resurrected after the nightmare of debt once again felt precarious. Some magazines that had once eagerly courted my every word now looked upon my submissions with a wary eye. My public introduction of Winston Churchill in 1900, infused with a sarcasm that cut deeper than any overt insult, was a mere prelude to the acid bath I regularly administered to the political landscape. I understood, with a chilling clarity, that the comfortable, marketable image of Mark Twain, the harmless humorist, was a shield I could no longer afford to wear. My conscience wouldn't permit it. The ghosts of Susie and the countless unknown dead of foreign lands demanded more. Several of my most potent works from this period, those that peeled back the skin of human nature to reveal the festering greed and cruelty beneath, remained unpublished in my lifetime, not just because I was feared, but because I too had to contend with the practicalities of survival, of providing for my remaining daughter, Clara. I carried the bitter irony that the very truth I championed could, if fully unleashed, silence me altogether. Then, in 1903, as the cacophony of public debate raged around me in New York, a quieter, more devastating storm began to brew within the walls of my own home. Livy, my steadfast rock, my moral compass, began to fail. Her delicate health, always a concern, now succumbed to a lingering illness that stole her vitality day by agonizing day. We retreated to Italy, hoping the sun and the solace of the old world might mend her, just as it had once mended my fortunes. But the old world, for all its beauty, offered no miracle cure for a heart slowly giving way. She died in 1904, in Florence, her hand in mine. The world, already a place of shadows and disillusionment, plunged into a profound and echoing void. Susie's death had broken my heart, but Livy's shattered the very vessel. She had been the anchor, the gentle voice that could tame my wilder impulses, the unwavering belief in my better angels. With her gone, the last vestiges of the genial humorist seemed to wither. I was a man adrift on a dark sea, the angry prophet my only remaining identity. I returned to New York, carrying her memory like a phantom limb, a constant ache. The city that had once pulsed with my renewed energy now felt like a tomb. I continued my work with the League, my voice perhaps even more resonant now, imbued with a fresh layer of sorrow, a deeper understanding of the transient nature of all things precious. I lived in rented houses, moving from one to another, a restless spirit haunted by the past. My writings grew ever darker, plumbing the depths of human folly, questioning the very essence of virtue. I saw the world not as a grand design, but as a cosmic jest, a cruel experiment. in which humanity was the unwitting and often contemptible subject. In 1908, seeking a final refuge from the clamor and the ghosts, I moved to Stormfield, my last home, in Redding, Connecticut. It was a beautiful house, high on a hill, a place where I hoped to find some measure of peace in my twilight years. But peace, like honor, was a fleeting illusion. The world continued its march of folly, and my own personal tragedy was far from over. The year 1909 brought a brief, delicate flicker of joy. My middle daughter, Clara, my musical Clara, married. It was a moment of grace, a reminder that life, however brutal, still held the capacity for connection, for new beginnings. But even that small joy was quickly eclipsed. Later that same year, Jean, my youngest, my beloved Jean, suffered an epileptic seizure from which she did not recover. She was gone too. 3 daughters, gone. Susie, Livy, Jean. The attrition of my family had been a slow, agonizing amputation, leaving me a solitary gnarled tree buffeted by gales. I was 74 now, a man carved by grief, hardened by outrage, my famed white hair perhaps a symbol of the snow that now blanketed my soul. My heart, though broken 100 times over, still beat, still raged, against the injustices I perceived, the cruelties I had witnessed. 4 months after Jean's passing, on April 21, 1910, as Halley's comet blazed in the heavens, just as it had when I entered this strange, wonderful, and utterly horrifying world, I laid down my pen for the last time. My public commitment to truth, born of sorrow and outrage, had indeed not been silenced. My voice, sharper than any surgeon's scalpel, had cut its way through the comfortable lies of an era. I had seen the romantic and the real, the strengths and weaknesses of a rapidly changing world, and I had reported it all. And if my observations often revealed a humanity more prone to avarice than to altruism, more given to cruelty than to kindness, then that was the truth I found. And as I always said, supposing is good, but finding out is better, even if finding out breaks your heart.